Hello, Muslim friends in the world. That day began like any other. Clear skies and a gentle breeze that greeted the faces of the people of Sagaing, Myanmar. However, no one knew that deep beneath their feet, an immense force was rising, ready to shake everything above it. That morning, a man named Ang was walking to the market. He paused in front of the White Mosque, a building that had been a part of his life for many years. It was not only a place of worship, but also a source of peace for him. Without realizing it, he looked up at the sky, sensing something different in the air. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble. Then it grew stronger, louder. In an instant, a booming sound from deep within the earth reached every ear nearby. "Earthquake!" someone yelled in the market. The ground split open, and the clear sky seemed to turn dark. Buildings that had once stood proudly now staggered, and moments later they collapsed to the ground with terrifying crashes. Large stones fell, shards of glass flew, and people ran in panic, desperately searching for shelter. Ang, who had been walking casually, now ran as fast as he could to find a safe place. His heart raced. He could feel the earthquake was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. Everything he saw around him was turning to chaos in the blink of an eye. In the vicinity of the mosque, people who had been calm moments before now fell to the ground, scrambling to find shelter. Hundreds of buildings crumbled within seconds. The once bustling market turned into a sea of rubble and panic. But amidst it all, there was one sight that amazed Ang. Amidst the devastation, the White Mosque remained standing. It did not sway, it had no cracks in its walls. It seemed untouched by the immense force of nature. Ang, breathless from running, stopped for a moment, staring at the mosque with wide eyes. "Is this a miracle?" he thought, trying to calm himself. Around him, houses and shops had fallen into heaps of dust, but the mosque, it stood firm, as if it had not been affected by anything. The people around him stopped and gathered near the mosque. Some of them felt a strange sensation, a mix of fear, wonder, and a sense of peace that couldn't be explained. As the earthquake finally stopped, the atmosphere seemed to stand still for a moment. Everyone stood frozen, staring at the wreckage surrounding them, but their eyes remained focused on the mosque that stood tall. The earth shaking had ceased, but there was one thing they could not ignore: the miracle they had just witnessed. In the midst of the chaos and suffering, the mosque became a symbol of a greater power, and among the ruins, a whisper began to spread among the surviving people. "This is a sign." No one knew exactly what had happened, but a feeling began to grow in their hearts, that the White Mosque was more than just a building. It was something much more than that. Ang, despite his confusion and disbelief, felt something deep within him. He walked closer, stepping into the mosque's courtyard, feeling a calmness unlike anything he had ever felt. For a moment, the chaos around him seemed to disappear. "What is this?" he whispered under his breath. "Could it be a sign from God?" At that moment, no one could have imagined that what they were witnessing was only the beginning of a great transformation that would change the lives of many in Sagaing. The miracle was just starting, and there were many things they didn't yet understand about how this unseen force would alter their lives forever. After the devastating earthquake shook Sagaing, the atmosphere in the city became grim and full of destruction. The once bustling streets were now empty, littered with dust and rubble from the collapsed buildings. The survivors ran frantically to find their loved ones, trying to salvage whatever was left of their lives. The cries of sorrow filled the air as people reached out in desperation for shelter from the catastrophe that had struck so suddenly. But amid all the chaos, there was one place that seemed to be unscathed: the White Mosque. Ang, still breathless from running, gazed at the mosque with a mixture of disbelief and awe. He couldn't quite understand what was happening, but deep inside there was an unshakable feeling, a feeling that something more than coincidence was at work. Surely a building couldn't remain untouched in the face of such a powerful earthquake, or could it? Not only Ang was moved by this, but others began to approach the mosque as well. Slowly yet steadily, people started walking toward the mosque, their steps unsure but drawn by something they couldn't explain. Some women who were used to shopping at the market stopped dead in their tracks and simply stared at the mosque. There was a calmness they couldn't quite understand, but they felt it with every fiber of their being. "This mosque, how could it be?" asked an older man standing beside Uang. "Is this a sign from Allah?" replied a younger woman, her eyes wide with wonder. Her face, once filled with anxiety, now showed a glimmer of hope. They all fell silent, their gazes fixed on the mosque, which had remained perfectly intact. Its white walls glistened in the light, and it stood tall, as if defying the destruction around it. It wasn't just a building to them, it had become a symbol of something much larger, something beyond their comprehension. Uong walked closer, his feet moving almost automatically, as if drawn to the mosque by an invisible force. As he stepped into the mosque's courtyard, the air felt different. A strange peace enveloped him, and the sense of turmoil that had been gnawing at his heart began to fade. Inside the mosque, the silence was profound, broken only by the faint sound of a breeze flowing through the open doors. A few others followed Uong into the mosque. They stood around, hesitant, unsure of what to do. They had come to see the miracle of the mosque, but now they were unsure of the next step. Some sat on the floor, others just stood quietly, overwhelmed by the sense of calm that surrounded them. There was no panic, no fear, only peace. The air in the mosque was heavy with something unspoken, but at the same time, it was soothing, as if the walls themselves were holding them in a protective embrace. The people who had entered felt as if time had slowed down. The outside world, with all its chaos and destruction, seemed distant. They were no longer in the city of Sagaing. They were in a place of sanctuary, a place of divine protection. "I've never felt anything like this before," a young man whispered. "It's as if this mosque is protecting us." As more people entered the mosque, the whispers spread. Some had never even considered stepping inside a mosque before, but now they found themselves seeking solace here. Many of them, some of whom had barely ever thought of God, began to pray. Others simply sat in silence, reflecting on the immense change that had just occurred. There was something about the mosque that made them feel different. Even if they didn't understand it, they could feel it deep within their hearts. The mosque was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol of protection, a sign that something greater than themselves had intervened. As time passed, more people arrived. Those who had survived the earthquake, those who had lost everything, began to gather. Slowly but surely, the White Mosque had become the heart of this new transformation, a place of hope and solace in the midst of overwhelming grief. Uang stood at the center of the mosque, looking around at the people who had gathered. He knew that something significant was happening. The mosque wasn't just standing firm, it was drawing people together, offering them peace that could not be found anywhere else. For the first time in his life, Uang felt a deep connection to the people around him. He felt an unspoken bond with those who had entered the mosque, a bond that transcended their differences. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that this was the beginning of something far bigger than just the survival of a building. It was the beginning of a spiritual awakening. This mosque, it's not just a building, Uang thought. It's a message from Allah, calling us back to the right path. Days passed since the earthquake, and while the destruction of Sagaing remained a painful memory, the White Mosque had become a symbol of hope and strength for the people. More and more survivors from various backgrounds had found themselves drawn to the mosque. The once bustling streets now felt silent, but the mosque became a place of gathering, a sanctuary for those seeking refuge and peace. Uang had spent much of his time at the mosque, observing the growing number of people who came to sit, pray, and reflect. He had become something of a guide to the newcomers, especially to those who had never before stepped into a mosque. His heart had been touched by the incredible sense of peace that enveloped the mosque, and he found himself compelled to share the message he felt so deeply within him. Every day, he would give short talks to the growing group of people who visited. He spoke of patience, of faith, and of the strength that could be found in surrendering to God's will. His voice, once soft and unsure, now resonated with a newfound confidence. The earthquake did not happen to punish us, Uang would say. It happened to awaken us, to make us realize how fragile life is and how we must strengthen our bond with the Creator. This mosque is standing as a symbol that God's mercy and protection are always with us, even in the darkest of times. At first, only a few people listened to him, skeptical but curious. But over time, as Uang's words grew in strength and sincerity, His message began to resonate with more and more individuals. It was as if the collective grief and confusion that weighed heavily on the people of Sagaing began to lighten, replaced by a quiet, slowly growing faith. One afternoon, as Uong sat outside the mosque reflecting on the progress made, he was approached by Ko Min, a young man who had once been very vocal about his doubts and skepticism regarding religion. Ko Min had been one of the first to arrive at the mosque in the aftermath of the earthquake, but he had stayed on the fringes, observing rather than participating. "I don't understand," Ko Min said, sitting down beside Uong. "I've been coming here for days, and every time I leave, I feel something change inside me. But I don't know what it is. Why does this mosque make me feel so calm?" Uong smiled warmly. "It is not the mosque itself, Ko Min, but the peace that comes from knowing there is something greater than us, something that has protected this place and us. What you're feeling is the call to a greater understanding. It is the call of Allah, drawing you closer to Him." Ko Min shook his head. "I don't know if I believe in all of that. I've lived my whole life without any faith. I don't even know where to begin." Uong looked at him thoughtfully. "Faith is not about having all the answers. It's about starting the journey. The fact that you are here, feeling what you feel, shows that your heart is open. You don't need to know everything at once, Ko Min. Just take the first step. Come and pray with us. Let your heart speak, and the rest will follow." Ko Min fell silent, clearly conflicted. He had grown up surrounded by a culture that was largely skeptical of religion, and the idea of suddenly embracing something so foreign to him seemed overwhelming. But there was a stirring inside him that he couldn't ignore. Something in Uong's words had reached deep within him, and he couldn't deny the calm he felt whenever he was near the mosque. That evening, for the first time, Ko Min decided to stay and join the others in prayer. He stood at the back of the mosque, unsure of what to do, but following the movements of the others as best as he could. The sound of the prayer, the rhythm of the words, the soothing cadence, seemed to wash over him. As he recited the words, he felt an unexplainable connection, as though his soul was reaching out to something much larger than himself. The experience was transformative. For the first time in his life, Ko Min felt a profound sense of peace, as if he were finally where he was meant to be. The worries and doubts that had once consumed him seemed to fade away, replaced by a quiet assurance that everything would be all right. As the days passed, more people like Ko Min began to step into the mosque and experience similar transformations. The mosque, once just a place of refuge from the physical destruction of the earthquake, had become a spiritual sanctuary. People who had never prayed before found themselves drawn to the mosque, curious about the peace they felt in its presence. The community in Sagaing, once broken by tragedy, began to heal in a way they had never expected. The White Mosque had not only survived the earthquake, it had become a center for spiritual rebirth. People began to pray together, reflect together, and support one another in ways they never had before. The impact of the mosque began to spread beyond the immediate community. News of the miracle that had saved the White Mosque from destruction spread throughout Sagaing and beyond. People from neighboring towns began to come, seeking solace, seeking answers, seeking peace. And every time they entered the mosque, they too felt the same calm, the same assurance that there was a force at work greater than any of them could fully understand. One morning, Uong stood outside the mosque, gazing at the horizon. He had never felt so certain in his life. This was no ordinary place, no ordinary event. The White Mosque had become a beacon of light in a dark world, a symbol of God's mercy and grace. It had awakened something in the hearts of the people, something that had been dormant for far too long. And Uong knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. As the weeks went by, the transformation that had begun in the White Mosque continued to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The once devastated city of Sagaing, now scattered with rubble and remnants of broken lives, slowly began to rebuild, not just with bricks and mortar, but with something far more powerful: faith. The mosque had become a place where people not only sought physical shelter, but also spiritual solace. The peace that had radiated from the White Mosque continued to draw people from all walks of life. Those who had lost everything found themselves finding something far more precious: a renewed sense of hope. Uong, who had been at the center of this spiritual awakening, now stood as a beacon of guidance for the many who had found their way to the mosque. His words, once filled with doubt and uncertainty, now carried the weight of a man who had found his purpose. His voice had grown stronger, his heart sure of the path he was guiding others down. One morning, as he stood before the growing crowd inside the mosque, Yuang felt a deep sense of fulfillment. More and more people had come forward to embrace Islam, many of them after feeling the inexplicable peace that the White Mosque offered. It was not just the mosque's structure that was miraculous, it was the way it had brought them closer to something far greater. "I see many of you here today," Yuang began, addressing the crowd that had gathered for prayer. "You have come seeking peace, and you have found it in this mosque. But peace is not something that resides only within these walls. It is something that can be carried with you wherever you go. It is a gift from Allah, and it begins in your hearts." Many of those gathered nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting the same calm that had overtaken their souls. Yuang had become more than a guide. He had become a symbol of the strength that faith could provide in even the most difficult times. Among the crowd was Ko Min, the young man who had once been skeptical of faith. He had stood at the back of the mosque for days, unsure of where his beliefs stood. But now he was standing at the front, his heart and mind fully embracing the teachings he had once dismissed. His conversion to Islam had been a gradual process, one that had started with curiosity and was now fully realized in his heart. "I never thought this would happen," Ko Min said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But every time I come here, every time I hear the prayer, I feel something inside me shift. It's like my heart was a locked door, and now it's open." Yuang smiled at him. "The door to faith is always open, Ko Min. It is not the mosque itself, but the faith in Allah that transforms us. You have taken the first step, and now you will walk this path with the guidance of Allah." The impact of the White Mosque began to spread beyond the city of Sagaing. People from other towns and villages, hearing the story of the mosque's miraculous survival, began to travel to Sagaing in search of the peace that had been found there. What had begun as a local phenomenon soon became a movement. The story of the mosque's survival and the way it had brought people together in the aftermath of the earthquake inspired many to seek faith, healing, and hope. News spread quickly, and soon even people who had been raised in different faiths were making their way to the mosque. Some came seeking answers, others seeking solace from the pain they had experienced. Regardless of their backgrounds, they all found themselves standing in awe of the mosque, experiencing the same inexplicable sense of peace that had touched so many before them. One day, a group of villagers arrived from a neighboring town. They had heard rumors of the miracle of the White Mosque and wanted to see it for themselves. As they approached, their eyes widened at the sight of the towering mosque, still as pristine and unscathed as it had been since the earthquake. A man named Zhao Ti, who had lost his family in the disaster, was among the group. He had walked for miles, his heart heavy with sorrow. But as he stepped into the mosque, something strange happened. He felt a warmth inside, a lightness he hadn't known since the tragedy struck. "I lost everything," Zhao Ti whispered to Yuang. "But I feel something I can't explain. It's as if my heart is no longer heavy. Is this the peace you speak of?" Yuang placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is the peace of Allah, Zhao Ti. It is not a peace that comes from our circumstances, but a peace that transcends all things. It is a peace that can only be found when we surrender our hearts to Him." Zhao Ti nodded, tears filling his eyes. For the first time since the earthquake, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had come looking for answers to the questions that had plagued him since his loss. But now he realized the answers were not to be found in the world around him, but in the faith that had been rekindled within his heart. As the days turned into weeks, the White Mosque continued to grow in significance. What had once been a simple place of worship had become a symbol of hope, faith, and transformation. The people of Sagaing and those who had come from afar had found something more valuable than material possessions or worldly success. They had found peace. The earthquake, which had devastated the city, had also awakened something deep within the hearts of its people. Through the destruction and loss, they had been reminded of the fragility of life, and in that reminder, they had rediscovered their faith. The White Mosque had not only stood firm against the forces of nature, but it had also withstood the trials of the human spirit, offering strength and solace to all who sought it. In the end, the story of the White Mosque was not just about survival, it was about the power of faith, the strength of community, and the transformation that can occur when people come together in search of something greater than themselves. And as Uong stood at the mosque, watching the sun set over the horizon, he knew that the journey was far from over. The White Mosque would continue to shine as a beacon of light, drawing people from all corners of the world and offering them the peace and healing they so desperately sought.